What is the scariest thing you've ever seen in your life that you can't explain? 1. I've seen some pretty wild stuff in my life, but most of it is explainable. The one event that comes to mind was witnessed by my dad, brother, and myself, and it's a two-part encounter, but I still consider it one event. This is a bit long, and I apologize, but I feel it might be worth the read. It was around 1998. My family and I had just moved into an old clapboard house on the edge of town. It had a huge backyard with a 6-foot wooden privacy fence on one side and a metal chain link fence about 4.5 feet high around the other 3 sides of the yard. Neighbors on one side, the privacy fence side, a small grass alley that ran behind the back with a street light, and then another yard, etc. Our bedroom was an old converted sunroom on the back of the house that faces the backyard. It had floor-to-ceiling windows all along the back wall looking into the backyard. We didn't have many options as to where to place our beds, so my headboard was against the windows, and my brother's bed was about 8 feet away with his headboard against the opposite wall with the foot of the bed facing the windows. One night we were up pretty late, I was in my bed, and he was in his just talking about random things, when suddenly he got quiet. I figured he fell asleep, but then I heard him whispering in a shaky breath, so I'm like, "What?" And I hear him whisper again. So again, I'm like, "Speak up, I can't hear you." And he goes, "Don't move, and be quiet." In a forced whisper, but I, thinking he's messing with me and like, "Bitch, why?" And I'm looking at him, and mind you, my head is to the windows, and he's pointing into the backyard behind my bed. So quickly sit up and turn around and see this huge dog head staring almost nose to glass through the window right behind my bed. I'm almost nose to nose with this thing. Just a single pane of glass and about 10 inches of empty air separate me for this thing. Now when I say I screamed, I mean I screamed. Not my proudest moment, but hey, I was like 10 years old. Well, anyways, the thing quickly ducked under the window and then ran to the side of the yard and jumped the 4.5 feet chain link fence and bolted off into the darkness. My dad came running into the room with our mom right on his heels. We were able to get out that something was looking through our window, so Dad ran back to his room and grabbed his shotgun, and then headed out the side door of the house and into the backyard. Unfortunately, or fortunately, IDK, he didn't find anything, wrote it off as I had a nightmare, and my brother wouldn't admit to seeing anything, so I took the blame and was told to quit messing around, go back to bed, typical parent response, etc. Well, later that night, maybe an hour or so, after I begged my parents to let me sleep in the living room, because leaving the house wasn't an option, and still being refused, I was made to sleep in my room. So again, my brother and I are in our room with these floor-to-ceiling windows. We are just completely rattled. We are both huddled in his bed, staring out the windows, when we see this thing come walking along the chain link fence on all fours, and the fence only comes up to its mid-shoulder, so this thing is huge. It sniffs the ground, does a few circles, and then hops the fence into the backyard like it's nothing. It walks over to the window and again gets nose to the glass like it's trying to see in. We are panicking the whole time. Well, my brother is like, "Fuck this." And soon as he steps off the bed, we hear this loud bang, and there is a flash of light. The thing at the windows gets knocked sideways, and without even missing a beat, it turns and runs across the full length of backyard, jumps the back chain link fence. It cleared the fence, the alleyway, and then landed in the back neighbor's yard. This is easily a 15 to 20 foot jump minimum, clearing their fence like it was nothing, and was gone at a dead run, up beside that house and off into the darkness on the other side. My dad comes tearing around the side of the house with his shotgun in hand and makes a mad dash for the side door and slams it shut behind him. He is screaming and hollering, "We gotta go." We pack up and head to a hotel that night. My mom absolutely refused to believe we saw what we said we saw, and we only lived there for about 6 months. It rattled my dad so much he didn't even want to come back. He told my mom that we were just going to move that next day, but she wouldn't allow it. After about 6 months, she conceded, and we moved. Mind you, this is in the coastal plains region of Texas. We have no large wild canines here. We have stray dogs and coyotes, but nothing that would even remotely touch on how big this thing was. My dad swears he shot that thing with a slug from about 15 feet away with his 12-gauge shotgun right underneath its left arm, hitting it in the ribs, where its vital organs are, and nothing, it just ran off. He said the thing that freaked him out the most was that when he saw the thing jump the fence, it walked towards our window, crouched but still on its hind legs. It wasn't walking on all fours, and then when it got to our window, it stood up straighter, and he could tell that while it looked like a dog, its body was shaped wrong. He said it looked like a really stocky person wearing a dog suit, but he could tell it wasn't a suit. Also that when it was walking in circles sniffing the ground before coming into our yard the second time, it wasn't actually sniffing the ground like for a scent. It was staring at our window with its face to the ground like it was acting like it was sniffing the ground, almost as if it was playing a part to see if anyone would notice it. He said he's had dogs his whole life, and everything about what it was doing was wrong. A while later I asked my dad why he was in the backyard if he thought I was having a nightmare, and he told me my brother is the one that gave it away. He said with how panicked I looked, that my brother was almost white as a sheet and wouldn't take his eyes off the window. He said, "Your brother has never looked so scared, and never been one with just making stuff up." So after going back to his room with my mom as he was laying there thinking about it, he decided that if my brother was as white as he was, then we had to have seen something. So he grabbed his gun in case he had to scare some creeper out of our yard, and figured he was going to go through the garage and out by the far side of the house and sneak to the corner to see if someone was peeking in our windows, or if someone was actually messing with us. He never actually thought we saw a huge dog-looking thing, just that maybe with it being dark outside and us being kids with overactive imaginations, maybe we just mistook someone as something. But when he saw that thing come up the side fence and with the street light in the back alley lighting up the backyard, he saw it and it freaked him out. He was going to creep back inside until it went up to our window, and he said as it stood up, he just got this instant feeling of just dread, like something was going to happen to us. 2. When I was a child, both my parents went to work early, so they would drop me off at my grandmother's to eat breakfast and go to school from there. My grandmother died my junior year in high school, and I started coming straight home from school. During this time, my mother started complaining that when she get home from work, the receiver of the phone, an 80s style corded push-button phone, next to her bed was left off the base. I wasn't using the phone, but she would insist I must have, because the phone was hung up properly when she left for work. One day, I got home a little early. Now, I need to pause and tell you about the layout of our apartment. From the front door, I looked directly into the living room, dining room, the door to the kitchen, and the short halfway that led to my parents' bedroom and my bedroom. There was no other door. The windows were old-fashioned narrow casement windows with screens, and we were on the 3rd floor. Anyway, as soon as I walked in the door, I clearly heard 2 footsteps in my parents' bedroom. I dropped my school bag and foolishly ran to the bedroom. It wasn't far, and took only a few seconds. I got to the bedroom and no one was there. However, I immediately noticed that the receiver of the phone on my mother's bedside table was on the floor. It was placed so that the cord to the base was stretched out as far as it could go. I later tried to replicate the placement by shaking the table, tipping the phone, etc. I could never get the receiver off the base. When I finally resorted to knocking it off with a finger, it would fall on the table or next to it. The only way I could replicate the placement of the receiver where I found it was to carefully stretch the cord, place it, and hold it for a few moments. It could not have gotten to that spot by accident. When I found the phone, I hung it up, and it immediately rang. I answered it, and it was my dad. He asked what was wrong. I asked him why he asked. He said he had called, apparently just before I got home, and someone, he thought it was me, answered the phone but never said anything. He finally hung up and had been trying to call back, and only got through after I hung up the phone. I've never figured out what happened. I definitely heard footsteps, and I'm just as certain there was no one there. No one went by me. The windows in the bedroom were not disturbed, and my parents had too much stuff under the bed and in the closet for anyone bigger than an infant to hide in either spot. Also, after this, my mother never found the phone disturbed again. 3. I've shared this story on Reddit before, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. It's not exactly a scary thing I saw, but I still wonder about it all the time, so I'll copy and paste here. My best friend and I would always talk about crazy dreams we had. Never thought much of it, until he told me about one where he got hit by a car and died. We were about 15 to 16 when he told me about the dream. We were into conspiracies, stuff like aliens, paranormal, lucid dreaming, so we'd talk about stuff like that a lot. And he died right before he would have turned 20. He said he was riding a skateboard wearing all black when the car hit him and could see everyone at his funeral. He even said his crush was at his funeral and laughed about it. He just kept going on about how it was so real. And it really shook me up until eventually I forgot about it. Then a few years later, after I'd long forgot about the dream he told me about, it happened for real. His crush was at his funeral. He did get hit by a car and die. He was wearing all black like in the dream, his work clothes, and he was riding my skateboard. It was all true. I still don't know what to make of it all. Every single detail I remember from his dream came true, and I'm sure there's parts of it he told me that I don't remember. I felt crazy. I didn't tell anyone about. I just don't know why or how he saw it happen in his dream and think what if he never told me about it. It just left me with so many questions, but I guess now I have proof, at least to myself, that our souls go on after we die. I just wish I knew why he experienced that dream and told me about it, like there had to be some kind of reason. I just think about how I wouldn't believe this story if I hadn't experienced it for myself. Has anyone ever experienced anything similar? 4. My very first job was as a radio DJ at a small hometown radio station in the mid-1990s. This was a tiny building out in the middle of a field with a 500 FT antenna out back and a single road from the main road to the front door. The transmitter was right behind my studio, behind sound dampening glass, and had a light bulb that was always on. The station was so small that you could see the light bulb in the transmitter room all the way from the driveway/roadway. There were only two doors, the front door and the back door in the transmitter room. That door didn't even have a handle on the outside, and it was always locked from the inside. It's impossible to enter that door from the outside. I worked the evening shift, from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. After my shift, we actually went off the air for the night. I was always the last person there, so after I went off the air, I had to pull commercials for the first hour or two of the morning show, clean dishes, finish up some production work, etc. After working there for a year or so, I had racked up a couple of weird experiences. Shadows scurrying about at the corner of my vision, lights turning off and on. One evening, after getting in and taking over the board, I was just sitting there preparing myself mentally for the next 5 hours. I looked up, out the studio doors towards the front door, and I saw the perfect shadow shape of a man who was probably 6 feet tall. It was there. Then not. I went to my boss, who was not a nice person on her nicest days, and said, "So, I have a weird question." She sighed and looked at me, expecting who knows what. "Have you ever felt like someone was here who wasn't?" My boss yelled across the building for someone to come into her office. When that person arrived, she tilted her head at me. "He's seen Jimmy." Supposedly, everyone had seen Jimmy, the original owner of the radio station. He popped in from time to time. "He won't hurt you. He's just checking in on the station." So from then on, Jimmy would make his appearances. His was a harmless presence. My studio faced another unused studio, and he would flash the lights on and off a few times. I'd say, "Hi, Jimmy. Everything's going well." And it would stop. He turned a water faucet on once. He whispered my name in my ear one night, which freaked me out. At least I think it was him. You see, there was another malevolent being that also lived there at the station. It didn't have a name, and it was about shin high. This one always gave me a really bad feeling. It was the one who would dart beside me, its shadow just in the corner of my eye. I always knew it was there, just because I would feel downright freaked out. One night in particular was the scariest I've ever been. Here it is, 30-ish or so years later, and I still can't explain it. As soon as everyone left the building for the night, I got that feeling like it was there. I just turned on all the lights, turned the music up, and tried to ignore it. The longer the night went on, though, the worse it got. Lights were flashing everywhere. A dot matrix printer in the sales office started going on its own, something that never happened, and that office was locked. Then, ceiling tiles starting moving up as if someone hit them with a broom handle. They started closest to me from my studio, down the hall, and ended at the front door, which was locked. Then, the front door opened. A locked fucking door opened. I went down the hall to close and relock it. When I did, I saw through the door window that there was a coffee cup and a cigar on the front stoop. There was no reason for them to be there. On my way back to the studio, I got a big burst of cigar smell, like an invisible smoke cloud, right in my face. I knew my usual duties were required, but I didn't care at this point. I went off the air, grabbed my keys, and noped right the fuck out of there. I ran to my car, backed up, and looked through the front door. A figure was standing inside, silhouetted in front of the transmitter light. I peeled out and went straight home. Now, all of that is screwy, but it's not the most unexplainable thing. Is it 100% impossible someone didn't somehow sneak in and play a very elaborate prank on me? No. There's a slight, minuscule chance someone did. But to this day, I don't know how. It was an old, tiny building, but I still hold the possibility that it could have been a prank. I got home and told my mom this whole story. My heart was still pounding. She was all, "Shooey, well, it's bedtime." So I go to my bedroom and dial up a BBS to write someone what had happened to me. As I was typing up the story, my modem speaker turned on. If you are old enough to remember dial-up modems, you know the speaker doesn't just turn on once the connection is made. They wouldn't even turn back on if someone in the house picked up the phone. You'd just get a lot of bad data on the screen and your modem would disconnect. The speaker turns on, and a voice comes from the speaker, mixed with the static of the data connection. It screeched, "Help me!" The speaker then turned off, and nothing else changed on my screen. That speaker turning on and the voice coming out is solidified in my brain. I remember the screech like it was yesterday. I have no explanation for it. My mom was the only other person in the house, and she wouldn't have done something like that. She couldn't have done something like that. It was the scariest night of my life. I am as skeptical as you can be about anything ghost or UFO related, but that night is beyond my ability to explain. As kind of a footnote to all of this, I go back to that station every now and then when I go home to visit. I still know some people who work there. Jimmy is still active and is well known by the staff. The little scary one, no one else has reported seeing him. 5. When I was 9 years old, I was biking home in the evening. We lived in the countryside, up a small mountain. The road from the village was an uphill, a flat section, and then another uphill. The road lights only stretched to the end of the flat section. I was a bit afraid of the dark, so I stopped at the end of the road lights just at the bottom of the last uphill to gather courage to bike the last section home. It was a partial moon, so it wasn't pitch black, and at the end of the uphill I saw a figure walking down towards me. I thought I'd wait until he/she got closer, as I would feel less afraid to bike in the dark if there was someone else close. But about halfway down the hill, the person walked into a thin shadow of a tree on the road and never came back out. Just disappeared. I stood there for a while trying to figure out what I just saw, and then panicked and biked down to the village and stayed there until my parents came driving and wondered why I never came home. They tried to explain it with stuff like the person might have gone into the woods or something. What they didn't disclose, though, out of fear that I'd never dare to bike home again, was that my father had seen the same thing walking home from work. He had seen her clear as day, walking down the hill for a while. When he looked down for just a second and looked up, she was gone, and there were no footsteps in the fresh snow. I later read a book about local legends, and apparently a lot of people during at least a century have seen her walking down the hill and disappearing halfway down. My youngest daughter loved this story, so we've been on ghost stakeouts, where we buy pizzas and snacks and hang out at the bottom of the hill listening to the Ghostbusters theme song and try to see the ghost. 6. So in college I studied in the UK. I lived in a house with a group of other American students that had stories of the ghost of a girl who passed away while living there. I never believed in any of it, but it was fun to play along. The kitchen had one way in and out, and right after you entered the kitchen to your right was a padlocked door to the cellar where she allegedly lived. I had the only key. We were all a little homesick near Thanksgiving, so decided to do a meal together. This required some creative cooking schedules due to small appliances in the kitchen, so one girl who didn't have class the next day offered to stay up late to get the turkey going. We went into the cellar the first and only time that evening to get larger cooking implements. At 2:04 in the morning, I wake up to my door rattling, like someone was pushing against it. I assumed it was a housemate who just went to the wrong door. About 30 seconds later, when I hear a scratchy female voice softly saying hello every 5 seconds or so. My window was open, and it sounded like it was coming from outside, so I get up to close my window, as I assume it's some drunk girl walking back from the pub. I get to the window, and there's no one there. And then I hear, hello? Clear as a bell behind me, my door rattles again and goes silent. I've had night terrors before, and hallucinate when I have even a mild fever, so I assume I'm still asleep and lay back down. The next morning at 7 a.m., the girl who's cooking tells me, I had the creepiest night. At 1:50 I heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. Then the door rattled. Then at 2:10 the door rattled again, and I heard footsteps coming down. She told me this before I had said anything to anyone about what I'd experienced. 7. At one of my previous sysadmin jobs, we were closing down one of our smaller data centers as it was being consolidated into one of our larger ones, but we still had to have at least one person there in case of server issues that had to be dealt with on site. We rotated each week on which one of us would do the overnights there. The place was reportedly haunted by what I have no idea, just heard rumors from other coworkers when I hired in. So imagine a relatively large open office space that is completely void of all the cubicles, desks, etc. that are normally there, with just one desk and a few random cables hanging from the ceiling. Also, just the lights over my desk were working and bleeding out into my surroundings by about 3 feet. That was where I was for the week lull. I remember sitting there and just hearing ambient noise from the sorta far-off server room, fans, cooling system, etc., working on a server for a customer of ours, and seeing something dart across the room in my peripheral vision. I looked up and didn't see anything, so figured my eyes were just tired from the screen light and making me see like those floaties when your eyes close too tightly. Went back to work, and then about 5 minutes later I saw it again, although this time I heard the bathroom door open and shut. Big ass heavy door you pulled open, and the mechanism at top of door pulled it shut. Thought maybe one of my coworkers was here for a server fix, so got up and went to greet them and wait for them. About 10 minutes pass, and no one comes out of the bathroom. I go in to make sure they're not passed out or hurt. One of my coworkers suffered from seizures. But lo and behold, empty bathroom. Now I'm creeped out. leave the bathroom, and this time see the shadow person thing on the other side of the room dart across again, but looking at it straight on and not from my peripheral vision. Quickly went over and threw the rest of the lights on and started searching the whole office and server room for a coworker, as I was 100% sure they were fucking with me. Never found anyone. Rest of the night was uneventful, as well as the rest of the week, minus me basically shitting bricks sitting at my desk waiting for something else to happen. 8. This isn't my story, it's my uncle's. A bit of backstory: he used to work on the London Underground, doing maintenance to the tracks/tunnels, etc. Once he went into a tunnel with 2 other colleagues. They'd stopped to do something, and this man said to my uncle, like, "Hey, uncle's name, can you show me the way out?" My uncle, thinking it was one of his guys, said, "You know the way out." I think he was so engrossed in his work that he didn't turn around to see this bloke to start with. So this guy says, "I'm so cold." Then my uncle said he immediately felt dead cold, and the air around him dropped. Not sure what he meant by that. So my uncle turns around and shines a light on him. My uncle said to me this bloke is what he would call a ghost. Standing there, he was holding a really old/vintage lamp and wearing a really old dirty uniform. He said the feeling he got was so strange, as if he knew this bloke was a ghost. The bloke just kept saying over and over again, "I'm so cold, I'm so cold." My uncle eventually said to this guy, "I don't think you're supposed to be here, mate. Can you see a light anywhere?" And he looked dead at my uncle and said, "Can you help me? I'm so cold." I'm unsure if the colleagues came to see who my uncle was talking to, but one of them tried to approach this bloke thinking it was someone in their team playing a joke, and this bloke just disappeared right in front of their eyes. All of them freaked out and ran. They refused to go back into the tunnel. My uncle and 2 colleagues refused to go down that tunnel again. Some other colleagues have said they've seen this bloke, and he always says how cold he is. My uncle's retired now, but says he thinks of this bloke from time to time. 9. Once when I was around 12. I was riding my bike on the trails near a golf course. There's high-tension power lines going through the park, so a clearing runs through the forest. A car pulled through the clearing, and I noticed the back seat is full, but only the driver up front. They stop, everyone gets out, and they drag a guy screaming out of the back seat, beat him up a bit, and shot him twice. Once in the gut, for pain and suffering, I suppose, and once in the head. They stuff the dead guy back in the back seat, everyone piles back into the car just as before, and off they go. I stayed hidden in the brush, dumbfounded and scared to death, until they were out of sight. I go over to where the car had been. No mess at all, just tire tracks and footprints, like it hadn't actually happened. I rode home and didn't tell anyone what I saw. After supper, everyone got into whatever they were doing. So I went to my parents' BR to use the phone. Called 911 to report it, told them I wanted to remain anonymous. They thanked me for the report, and I hung up. Never heard anything about it on the news. They must have done a good job getting rid of the body. But I still find it weird that I couldn't see any remnants of what I'd just seen right in front of my own eyes. So I've had this memory of watching a man murdered for close to 40 years now, and I think it has influenced my outlook on everything. 10. I was about 12 at the time. Every year, my parents and I would drive from Montreal to Nova Scotia to visit family. Having always gone the Trans-Canada route, we decided to go through the States for a change, so we ended up going SE through Maine, and eventually on to NB, then NS. I remember we were in a very, very remote area. Like hadn't seen a house for a long time. This was before GPS and Google Maps. So there was a growing concern in the vehicle that we might run out of gas. I don't remember the name of the road, but it was a country road that had mountain on the right side, went straight up through dense bush, and on the left it was dense bush owl, and a steep downhill where I could make out a river at the bottom of the cliff, about a 75 to 100 down the hill. Trees hung over the road, so despite it being a sunny day, the road was shady, with the exception of places where the sun would break through. I heard my dad up front ask Mom, "What the fuck is that up ahead?" As I leaned over to look up down the road, we could all see what looked like a man off in the distance on the side of the road. Too far to see color or anything, just a big dark shape standing there. As we rolled on down the road, this dude or whatever it was crossed the road. Both lanes in, I shot you not 3 to 4 steps. Once on the other side of the roads, just vanished into the woods. As we got to the spot where he had crossed, Dad slowed right down to look around. Nothing. Not a sight of anyone. No trail, nothing. No one knows what they saw, but 30 years later it gets brought up every couple of years, and the feelings are mutual. Fucking weird and creepy. 11. Was looking out my bedroom window late one summer night at stars. I noticed an oddly colored flashing star that was 100% moving. If you've ever seen a ping pong ball held up suspended by an airflow, that was the type of movement. I'd say bubbling is good description. This had me weirded out, so I pull out my phone and start recording it. Maybe 10 seconds later, the most terrifying thing I have ever seen happens. A fucking beam of white light, cylindrical, and bright, not as much as a helicopter spot search, but a high-power flashlight, appears in my neighbor's backyard, like a literal beam from heaven. Maybe 8 feet in diameter and from the blackness of space as far up as I could see. No source or anything visible. This light is first pointing in the center of their backyard, which is maybe 45 feet from my face. My window is on side of house at rear. Then it starts frantically moving around as if it was searching for something. I felt this in my whole body immediately. I was like, it's looking for me. Stomach on floor. Then it moves up the side yard, towards front of house still in neighbor property, but now only 20 feet from where I'm standing. It then diverted onto the side of their house and scanned up the wall to a window, directly across from me 15 to 20 feet. I slammed my window down closed, shit the blackout curtains, and quickly left my room and went to a bathroom in center of house with no window visible. This was so fucking terrifying and world-changing that I can't express with words. It 100% happened, and I felt it in my bones and everything. I had this feeling that it was a warning or something, like don't film or bring attention to me/us. It had to know that it wasn't my window, and was trying to frighten me. If it detected me filming with a phone from a star that's not our sun position in the sky, far as hell, it 100% knew exactly where I was. The neighbor's window wouldn't have even had a vantage point of it, due to how it was positioned. I was viewing it 45 degrees over their 2-story house, so the neighbor in that window, direct facing my window, couldn't physically see it or where it was. That and the guy feeling I mentioned are why I feel it was warning or intentionally scaring the life out of me. It put on a "we are searching for you" show right in front of me intentionally to dissuade me from giving it focused attention, filming. It worked too if that's the actual case. I still haven't scanned night skies since then, and that was 2 to 3 years ago, and I used to really look up at night for stuff a lot. Aside from altering my worldview/perspective completely, I knew now that something unimaginable to me exists, and it watched me watching it. It made me not afraid of night and the stuff up high, but motivated to not be doing it anymore. A surreal and insane experience. Thinking about it makes me get chills and tear up. Not sadness, but a feeling of overwhelmingness, and having a life-altering revelation. I've never told this publicly. I was feeling afraid to for a long time. Almost 3 years, and only my wife, parents, and a single friend heard this. Seeing this video made me think of it immediately. Like I was seeing something being targeted by something impossible/unknown, just like I felt. The event from first appears to it covering the neon or window, and me slamming window/curtains was maybe 7 to 9 seconds. No more than 10 and longer than 5. It's impossible to know exactly, but I'm pretty certain my range is right on it. The only other thing it could have been, still equally if not more terrifying, was an altered image of reality being uploaded to my mind. As in, I and only I would have seen this, and if anyone happened to have view of the area it happened, nothing odd would have been seen by them. IDK. Crazy shit though. I can't believe I'm actually posing it finally. 12. Back in college, me and my girlfriend would go back to her parents' old farmhouse and fool around after class. There was never anybody home. One afternoon, I'm standing in her kitchen, thirstily guzzling a post-sex Gatorade. Behind me was a back staircase leading to the second floor of the house. When I finished my drink and turned to leave the room, I noticed a little GIRL between 7 to 10 YO standing on the bottom step. My first thought was, oh crap, dot. Why didn't my girlfriend tell me there was a little girl in the house? I really hope she didn't hear what we were up to. But before I could speak, I realized something was off. She was semi-transparent and oddly two-dimensional in a way I can't articulate. Slowly, I came to the realization that I was staring at a ghost. There was nothing inherently frightening about the experience. Knowing I was in the presence of something unexplainable, I did everything in my power not to blink. I stared at her for a good 10 to 15 seconds, taking in every detail I could. She had a red and yellow summer dress on, long blonde hair that was tied into a couple of those old-timey braids at the end, black strapped shoes. Overall look gave me a 1940s to 1970s vibe. Fortunately for her, she seemed to have no idea I existed. She stood on the bottom step, looking out the back window towards the driveway like she was waiting for someone to arrive. I never took my eyes off her. Eventually she was just gone. I never believed in ghosts before that. I still don't believe in intelligent hauntings, but I'll certainly entertain the idea of residual energy and echoes of the past. 13. In 2002, I came home from college to the Cincinnati area and met up with a couple of high school friends. We were driving around in northern Kentucky around 9 p.m. It was unusually foggy that night. Low-hanging clouds, and the tops of the hills were completely hidden in the fog. I was riding in the back seat, and my two friends were in the front. Just after we crossed the bridge, I saw a light up in the fog and I assumed it was a helicopter. But that immediately made no sense since it was so foggy. Couldn't be a helicopter, there would be no visibility. I pointed it out to them, and they saw it. But because they were in the front seat, they weren't able to look out the back window, which is how I had the best view of it. I kept reporting what I saw. They eventually pulled over, and we watched for a minute, but then the light had disappeared. After waiting a couple minutes, we decided to keep moving. A few minutes later, it came back. The light was visible, and as I was watching, it was getting brighter and appeared to be getting closer to the hilltop, to the edge of the fog, and that's when it happened. I saw the edge of this round, dark thing pop out of the fog and hover there a little, almost like Jack Torrance's face sticking through the door on The Shining. I didn't see where the lights were being emitted from, they were still back far enough that they were in the cloud cover, but whatever I was looking at was a dark round surface. Obviously, my mind went straight to UFO. It's still inexplicable. I have no logical explanation for what it was or what it could be. A blimp is the best thing I could compare to, except this thing disappeared back into the clouds and the light went off. It wasn't until the last couple of years when the movie Nope came out that I kind of had a wee panic attack at the movies. The imagery used in that movie is very similar to what I saw that night. 14. About 20 years ago, as a nursing student, I was working a night shift on a very poorly staffed ward. It was sometime between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m., and I was making my rounds, checking blood pressure, pulse, and other observations. The hospital was in a fairly rural area, and through the window at the back of the ward, fields were stretching out into the distance. Some movement in the darkness caught my eye. Must be 150 meters away. I noticed what looked like a blurry figure, half ambling, half floating across the grass. It held some long walking stick, like a scythe without the blade. With each exaggerated movement, the figure seemed to shimmer, confusing me, fading. Within milliseconds, I froze in place. The hair on my arms stood up. My heart pounded with that feeling, when fear makes your blood run cold. Petrified, I called out for the only other colleague on shift. She arrived quite quickly. I just pointed, "What is that?" She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "I think it's a man," she replied. "It looks like a ghost." She squinted, looked again, and said, "No, it just looks like a man. I'd better call security." As I stood there, still in shock, the ghostly image gradually sharpened. The white, billowy form-like robes turned into a patient gown, and the scythe was actually an IV pole with a bag attached. He was ambling across the grass, making exaggerated movements because the IV pole wheels don't work well on grass, and kept getting stuck in the mud. My colleague returned, confirming that security had got a report of a patient who had absconded from a ward, and were grateful we'd been able to locate him. To this day, I can't explain how patients manage to slip away from wards in the middle of the night. Anyway, this is the story of how I discovered I was short-sighted. I booked an eye test the next week. 15. I grew up in a haunted house in Canada, from the age of 7 to 18, so I have seen and experienced a lot of incidences that I cannot and will not attempt to explain. I feel like this background will give a little context to what happened last week. The house in Canada was obviously haunted. Doors slamming, orbs, shadows, electronic phenomenon, you name it, this house had it. Whatever resided there was never malicious to any of us, maybe even playful when we were kids. But I can say that other than being a little confused, I was not afraid of it. Last week, my wife and I flew to York, UK, lovely town which is made even more special by the people who live, curate, and care for this absolute gem of a town. We spent 3 days wandering around, shopping, and drinking pints with the locals. Part of that shopping involved going into a 4-story antique store by the Minster. The first floor was really cool. Lots of housewares from a bygone era. Second floor was records. Third was curiosities gathered from a life of travel. The fourth floor was fucked up. As my wife and I rounded the banister, it felt like I walked into the saddest, angriest place I have ever been. On one wall was WW1 medals, on the other was WW2 medals, and in the middle a rocking horse. I do not know what, who, or why. All I knew is I had to run for my life. The darkness that saturated every inch of that room was indescribably terrifying. I abandoned my beautiful wife in a room with the darkest presence I have ever experienced. I sprinted from the building and sat on the front steps waiting for wife to come down and ask, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" She eventually meandered down and said, "Yeah, you felt that too, huh? The rocking horse started rocking when you ran. And this, folks, is why I will not be going back there." 16. I'm not typically one to believe in the supernatural, but something happened to me a few years ago that I still can't explain. Even thinking about it now gives me chills. and I've often wondered if someone out there might have experienced something similar. Here's my story. I was on a road trip with a couple of friends, headed to a small town known for its scenic mountains and forests. We were planning to camp out in a clearing not far off the main trail to watch the stars, and just get away from city life for a few days. Everything was going well. We reached the clearing just before dusk, set up our tents, and got a fire going. The atmosphere was just perfect, and we felt completely isolated from the rest of the world, which was exactly what we wanted. Around midnight, the conversation started winding down, and the forest was completely quiet except for the occasional crackle of our fire. We were starting to get sleepy when I suddenly heard what sounded like faint, distant music. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but I noticed my friend looking around too. I asked him, "Do you hear that?" He nodded, looking just as confused as I felt. We strained our ears, trying to place the sound, and realized it was coming from deeper in the forest, beyond where our firelight could reach. It was a strange, melodic humming, almost like a lullaby. The weird part was how it seemed to echo around us, as though we were in a large, hollow room. We thought maybe some other campers had brought a radio or something, but the music didn't sound modern or even like any genre I'd ever heard. It was haunting and beautiful, yet it had this deeply unsettling quality. We debated investigating, but ultimately decided against it. It was late, we were in an unfamiliar forest, and we didn't have a strong enough light to make it far. So we sat there, listening to the eerie music, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. It kept going, growing louder, almost like it was getting closer, but we still couldn't see anything beyond the firelight. Then something really bizarre happened. All at once, the fire suddenly dimmed, and the whole clearing felt cold, like someone had sucked all the warmth out of the air. The music was clearer now, and it was almost as if it was coming from all directions. My friend whispered, "I think we should go back to the car." He didn't have to tell me twice. We quickly grabbed our essentials, left the rest, and started moving back toward the trail. As we hurried through the dark, the music seemed to follow us, fading and growing louder in waves, almost like something was pacing us from a distance. At one point, I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the trees, a shadow that didn't quite match any of the natural shapes. We finally made it back to the car, locked ourselves in, and drove back to the nearest town without looking back. When we went back the next morning to grab the rest of our gear, everything was exactly as we'd left it, but the clearing felt different somehow, like something had been disturbed. Even in broad daylight, I felt like we weren't alone. To this day, I can't explain what we heard that night. We've tried rationalizing it as maybe a strange echo or another group of campers playing music, but no one in town had seen or heard anything unusual that night, and the nearest campsite was miles away. I've since talked to other people who enjoy camping or hiking in remote places, and while some have strange stories, no one's described anything quite like this. Part of me wonders if it was just some shared hallucination or a trick of the mind, but we all heard it, and we all felt the cold, hollow feeling in the clearing. I still don't know what to make of it. 17. When I was a kid, maybe 10/11ths, my family was visiting my grandparents in the mountains in Colorado. I woke up in the middle of the night to my bedroom door slowly opening and subsequently a cold wind blowing at me. A wolf figure slowly came around the corner, but it had a kind of purple glow to it. Once I made eye contact, I couldn't break it. In my mind, I felt that it was asking me to follow. So I got out of bed and slowly walked toward the door. The wolf turned around and started walking down the hallway. When I got to the door, it was gone. I suddenly felt extremely scared and ran back to bed and hid under the covers. Fast forward about 8 years. I was back visiting my grandparents with my cousin. We were working at a local hotel, breaking ice off the sidewalks for 8 hours a day. One night, we decided to take a walk, and about a quarter mile from the house, a wolf was standing in the middle of the road. We were 30 yards away when we saw it and froze. Mind you, wolves hadn't been in Colorado for decades at this time. It was alone. We slowly started walking back to the house, and it started to walk as well, keeping its distance and its pace. We sped up, it sped up. We started running, it started a gallop. We got back to the house, ran inside, and slammed the door behind us. We went upstairs to look out the window, and the wolf was just sitting at the end of the driveway, staring at our window 18. My mom and I were driving up from Texas to Washington in late October. We stopped to rest in this national park in southern Colorado, and were pretty much the only people there. It was usually daylight when we stopped to rest, because my mom preferred driving at night. We were sitting there making something to eat when this guy on a bicycle went past us and just glared at us with these hate-filled eyes. My mom and I were pretty creeped out by him, but went on about our business and then laid down in the car to sleep. Her up front and my boxer and I in the back seat. I got this feeling like I was being watched, and then my dog's hackles went up and she started this really deep down kind of growl. She only ever made that growl when she was really bothered by something. I reached over and chambered a round in my shotgun, and my mom heard me and said, "Hey, are you awake? Do you want to get out of here?" And I said, "Hell yeah, I do." We got up and I stood guard with my shotgun and the dog when she packed everything into the car, and we left. We couldn't see him, but we could both feel him watch us. And the dog didn't settle down again until we'd left that place far behind. We made a beeline for Moab and stopped at this truck stop to rest instead. When we got up, we went in and got something to eat and met this really friendly trucker and told him what happened. He shadowed us north for quite a ways and then handed us off to other truckers. They shadowed us all the way to Idaho. They were all a great bunch of guys for sure. 19. I must start this by saying I'm on the fence about paranormal stuff. Like, I'd like to think there's something there, but I will also go through every single logical explanation I can first. Do my best to put stuff down to normal incidents, you know? Anyway, my old family home was a little off, like. It generally had a heavy air about it, and no matter how homely we tried to make it feel, you always felt at least a little unwelcome. We lived there 12 years, and it never felt like home. It was a pretty old house. 2,100-plus-year-old terraced houses knocked together in West Yorkshire, UK. Creepy arse coal cellar included. Although for some crazy reason, we only had access to one half. The other half was walled off with a single brick knocked out for ventilation. On a night, I'd be laid up all night listening to the sound of a person walking up and down the landing. Wasn't my parents, as I knew their footsteps, and wasn't my younger sisters, as the footsteps were too heavy. They'd move along the landing, from the top of the stairs, stopping outside my room. Then walk back to the landing. Used to creep me the fuck out, as I could never see a shadow of anyone stood outside my door either. You'd hear voices and bangs in the other rooms of the house when no one else was in. Not the neighbors moving around or sounds of the house settling either. The scariest thing that ever happened was one night, not long after we got our first family dog. I'm sat in the living room with my dad watching TV. Now the two houses knocked together part is important here. Because of this, one half of the lower floor was the living room. The other half was the kitchen/dining area. There were entrance doors for both halves by the front and back doors, so you could walk a full circle round the downstairs going past both external doors. We were just chilling out. The dog was vibing sprawled by the radiator under the front window. All of a sudden, we hear an almighty bang, the sound of the back door slamming shut and rattling. Because of the location of the door, we even felt the vibration. A couple of seconds later, our dog goes ballistic barking at the hallway. I go to see what's going on, and the front door is wide open. There's nobody out on the street that could have opened the door and nowhere someone could have run to hide without us seeing/hearing them. Go to check the back door and it's all locked up with the chain on and everything. Creeped me out for a good while, and I refused to be home alone for a couple weeks after. 20. Most of the really scary things in my life have gotten explanations eventually. The one that remains very scary even after learning what was going on was a hike I took. My husband and I took our baby to his parents to meet them. It was calving season, so they couldn't leave the ranch, and we didn't want them to miss out on the newborn phase for our baby. Once there, my husband gets to work helping on the ranch. I was still recovering from a difficult labor, third-degree tears, etc. So I was absolutely not allowed to help pull calves or haul hay bales. So I decided to use our baby carrier and take some slow walks through the canyons around the ranch. It's a beautiful area. For the first time out there, I saw butterflies. Not just one or two, but a whole little cloud of them. I followed them to a little dry canyon where I could see a stream a little ways beyond. There were 4 or 5 different types of butterflies, and just dozens and dozens of each type. When the wind shifted, I smelled intestines. Looking around, I realized there were a lot of dead things nearby, in various states of skeletal remains. At least one cow, an elk, and a mule deer. A few bones that looked like coyotes. Lots that were just old and scattered. But there was one that looked like it was recent. Really recent, just laying under an overhang. That was the one I'd smelled when the breeze shifted. I had passed it on my way into the canyon without seeing under the butterflies, and had to pass it again to leave. Later my father-in-law would explain that butterflies in the desert will drink sweat and tears from mammals to survive. And if there is blood around, they will drink that for the salt. Also, cougars/mountain lions like to find canyons or dry washes that lead to streams, as those tend to funnel wildlife through narrowed paths. The mountain lion perches above on a rock or tree branch and waits to drop down on the animals passing beneath. They will hunt along wildlife corridors and overpasses for the same reasons. This method allows the mountain lion to take down animals larger than itself, like elk or cattle. There wasn't hardly any meat missing from that deer, maybe a pound or two. I'd interrupted the lion's meal when I walked into its funnel. That particular cat was well known to the ranch. He was about 15 years old at that point, and had been hunting closer and closer to the barns that year, to the point he'd been seen in between the house and the barn, and some of the barn cats had gone missing. Cougars get desperate for easier prey as they age, and it's uncommon for them to live as long as that one did. He finally passed at around 16 or 17 years old.